Visual storytelling can be tricky, especially in photography, where your photos have to speak without any words. And the issue is, if your viewer doesn't understand what they're looking at, the story of your photo is kind of lost. But there is a concept that can help you make sure that your story is understood. And that concept is context. And by using the methods I'm going to share in this video, you'll be able to shape the story of your photo with intention. So in this video, we are going to analyze a couple of photos so you can see how context impacts your photo and also how you can add context to your photography. And by the end, you'll be able to tell stories without using words. Okay, real quick, before we analyze the photos, I want to share with you a quote from Austin Kleon's book, Show Your Work, because in it, Austin Kleon quotes the British writer John le Carré, who says, "The cat sat on a mat is not a story, but the cat sat on the dog's mat is a story." And I feel like this is a very good example of adding context to create a story, because just by adding a tiny detail of who the mat belongs to, the whole story suddenly unfolds in your head. You may be thinking about what happens next or what happened before that. Why did this cat decide to sit on the dog's mat? And this whole idea of a conflict between these two maybe starts to unfold in your head. And that is because of context. Okay, so if we apply this to photography, we basically need two things. We need a main character, like the cat, and we need supporting characters, like the dog. And by introducing the dog as a supporting character, we add context to our main character. And this is the moment the main character becomes interesting, because just writing about a cat may not be as interesting. But introducing the idea that there is an opposing character makes this whole thing a story. So these characters, these supporting characters, they add context to your main character. And in photography, you can add this kind of context to your composition by using visual patterns. So in the following, I'm going to share with you a couple of visual patterns and one bonus element that is not quite a pattern, but still very important, that you can use to add context to your photos and to shape the story of your photo in an intentional way. Well, okay, future Rich here. While editing, I noticed this video would be way too long. So I decided to split it into two parts. This is part one, and I'll upload the second part once I'm done editing it, which will be probably 1 week from the day I posted this video. So in this video, I'm going to cover 3 different visual patterns that you can use in your visual storytelling to control the story of your photo. And the future video will cover 2 more visual patterns and the bonus element I just mentioned. I'll link the video in the description once it's out. And yeah, with that being said, have fun with this video. Okay, so the first pattern is frames. These can isolate your subject and also highlight it, so making it more visible than anything else in the frame. And they can also add context to the surroundings of your subject or the situation in which you took the photo. So let's have a look at some examples. Okay, so in this first example, the frame is quite obvious, but it's also somewhat natural because this whole scene takes place at a harbor, and you can tell that this frame is basically just from a part of a ship. And what this does is add context to my situation in which I took the photo. So the idea here was to photograph this building in the background, which is the Elbphilharmonie. It's just a famous and very popular building in the city. And I decided to photograph it from a different angle because you can take lots of photos of this place and of this whole harbor, which is kind of iconic. But by adding this kind of frame, you create a story, because this story suddenly is not just about the harbor or this piece of architecture looking kind of nice. It's about the journey, basically. It's either about the journey toward this location, or maybe even the journey from this location to a different point. If I just look at the photo, I can't tell, but this is the whole point of it. The point is to introduce context to your photo and to make your viewer think about things like what happened before I took this photo, or what happened after I took this photo, where did I go? All these things are starting points for the story inside your viewer's head. So by using a frame, you can make your photo more interesting and kind of highlight your subject, but you can also add context and create a story in your viewer's mind. Okay, so in this next example, the frame does add context and it also kind of creates this visual hierarchy. So again, we kind of feel like the mountain in the middle is more interesting because it's framed within this gate, and it also gives you a kind of context because this mountain, if you've seen it before, you may notice it. It's Mount Fuji in Japan. But if you haven't seen it before, if I would just look at the mountain, I wouldn't be able to tell that this is the Mount Fuji. But by adding this frame, we get a little more context because this frame, this gate, is part of a Japanese religion that is native to Japan, and I think you rarely find these kinds of gates anywhere outside of Japan. So this frame gives us a context about the location in which I took the photo. So this kind of adds to the story that this is in Japan, and it kind of combines two very iconic elements of Japanese culture. So this whole photo kind of represents this idea. Okay, this is the last example for frames, but this is also very important, I feel like, because this photo, I feel like, has a very strong story because of these two characters. It's a young family, it's a mother and her daughter, and they are on their way. Either they just arrived at home, or maybe they just arrived at their location to which they are going out to explore. And what this frame does is not only highlight these two and kind of block distractions, like all these leaves and the stuff is kind of blocked out, but that's not the only thing. It also kind of underlines the story of going out. So they're basically leaving this place, they are leaving a building and going out on a journey. So it kind of connects the visual part of leaving something with the act or with what they are doing. They are setting out to explore a location, for example. And this kind of connects the story in a visual way. So it's not just about people going, but it's about people leaving a place and also going on a journey to explore a place. And it's a kind of subtle way to kind of give context and to kind of shape the story in a stronger way. Okay, next up is contrast. So, in its most basic form, contrast is the difference between light and dark. But it can also be about contrast in colors, like complementary colors or just colors that look very different. And there's also the idea of conceptual contrast or juxtaposition, where you contrast two elements that have different characteristics, like old versus new or small versus big. And we'll have a look at each of these for an example. So, starting with tonal contrast, is fairly obvious. The skyline, the whole city is dark in this example, and our subject, the Tokyo Tower, is very bright and also of a very noticeable color. So, what this does is, for one, it kind of highlights the subject. That's very obvious, but it also kind of underlines the story of Tokyo as a city or as the city that never sleeps because there's literally a glowing tower in the middle of the night, or not middle of the night but at night. So this kind of gives that kind of gives a feeling to it because you can see there's lots of lights in these buildings, but I just feel like if we didn't have this tower, it would lack kind of an anchor point, so it would basically lack a subject, and it wouldn't be a photo about anything. It would just be a photo of the skyline. And by having this subject and contrasting it with all this dark in the photo, we kind of create this feeling of having something very exciting in the photo or in the city. And also, as I just mentioned, the feeling of even at night, there is something very big going on. Okay, so this example is about contrasting colors. And what is important here is that color in general kind of evokes emotion more than many of the other things I'm mentioning in this video. Color is usually connected with certain emotions. Now, there's of course various emotions connected to colors. So, cool colors are not just about sad feelings, but for simplicity's sake, let's just say that these two colors They balance each other because these cool colors are usually connected with more serene or isolated feelings, and warm colors kind of evoke the opposite type of emotion. So neither of these emotions takes overhand in the photo, and it's balanced out basically. And this helps me generally set the mood for this photo because this is supposed to feel very calm and very relaxing because it's a photo of birds in the sky, and it feels just like a very peaceful scene, and there's nothing exciting going on, and I don't want my colors to communicate anything exciting. So I decided to use these two colors and combine them to kind of underline the story of this being a peaceful morning on which I photographed these birds, basically. Okay, lastly, for contrast, we are looking at an example for juxtaposition. So, as I just mentioned, juxtaposition is basically the idea of combining at least two different things in the photo that are kind of contrasting each other in their meaning or in the associated meaning. So in this case, we have these leaves, which stand for nature. And we have these ships that are all man made structures and that are all kind of on the opposite side because they are, yeah, man made and they kind of are connected to industry and to building and to producing, which is often at odds with natural resources. So, this is basically the juxtaposition. And what this does is, for one, it creates a kind of visual interest, and it's meant to make the viewer think about the contrast between these two. So, it's more about expressing an idea, and by using these two contrasting elements like nature and man-made structures or nature and industry, you can make your viewer think about certain things that you want to communicate, basically like the idea of production or the producing industry being at odds with nature. And this is again a way to kind of tell a story and to communicate your idea. Okay, next up is colors. We just talked about colors, but let's have a more specific look at what colors do. So, for one, they can help your subject stand out, as in this example. There's very cool colors all around the subject, and this umbrella has a very warm color, which, yeah, kind of pops out and is a nice contrast. And yeah, it basically helps my subject stand out. But generally, as I just mentioned, colors kind of help evoke certain emotions. So they're not just about highlighting a subject or an idea, but they're meant to tell your viewer how to interpret the photo. So to evoke certain emotions. So in this case, I decided to make this photo a little cooler because it was at night, it was raining, and this whole situation is supposed to feel rather cold. So if you look at this photo with a different edit, with a little warmer colors, you'll notice that it just feels a little different. So if you just have a look. So if you just have a look at this, it's the same scene. Everything is the same. It's just that the color temperature is a little higher. And you can notice that, for one, the subject doesn't stand out as much because we suddenly have warmer tones all around it. And also, this doesn't quite feel like this rainy night on which I took the photo. It just doesn't have the same feeling to it. And that's the whole idea about it, basically. So, colors basically help us convey certain emotions and to tell the story of this rainy night that feels kind of isolated, maybe. And by looking at this photo, the feeling is just not as strong. And the story about this rainy night on which you may feel alone or isolated, maybe, it just doesn't feel the same compared to the colder photo, where I feel like this idea comes across a little more. So, this is really just a very subtle way to not just shape the story, but also the feelings that are connected to this story. Okay, so in this photo, I again used color contrast, but what I want to focus on here is the intensity of color, because these two colors are rather intense. So we have a dark orange and a dark blue, which is usual for sunset or for a late sunset. But what's important here is that these colors impact again the feeling of the story. And it's not just the contrast between these colors, it's also the intensity. Because the more intense your colors are, the more intense the whole feeling of the photo becomes. And it can just feel more dramatic. So in this case, we have a story about a ship departing. So it's basically a story of saying goodbye. And by adding intense colors, this whole feeling becomes more dramatic. Because if you think about it this way, you probably know this cliche of a cowboy riding into sunset, just like a real old Western movie, and the idea of, yeah, riding into sunset and saying goodbye. And this whole idea is very over dramatic, of course, and very cliche, but it kind of works. And this photo wasn't meant to be a modern interpretation of a cowboy riding into sunset, but it just follows the same trope of having the idea of saying goodbye and using a character that moves away from the camera and emphasizing this idea of saying goodbye by using very intense colors because they feel more dramatic. And the whole idea of saying goodbye is often dramatic. So, yeah, what I'm trying to say here is that the intensity of your color can very much impact the mood of your story and the mood of your photo. And by choosing intense colors, you can make your story more dramatic. And by using less intense colors, of course, you can make your photo less dramatic. So yeah, that's basically the point about colors and also the intensity of colors and the way they shape the story of your photo. Okay, this is it for part one of visual storytelling. And as I mentioned before, I split this video into two parts. So part two of this video will be linked in the description once it's out, which will be 7 days after I upload this video. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching. I hope this video helps you create with more intention, and I'll see you in part two.